Today's panel is on immigration, and our discussant is Cristina Mora, who is going to go ahead and take over from here.
All right, well, thank you for sticking through it, and thank you to the organizers for giving me a small role in this great conference. It's certainly a treat for me. Today we have two great presenters. The first is Dr. Hector Cordero-Guzman. Hector has roots in Chicago, deep roots in Chicago. He received his MA and PhD degrees in sociology and demography from the University of Chicago, and he's currently professor at the School of Public Affairs at Baruch College, the City University of New York. He's also a professor in the PhD program in sociology and urban education at the City University of New York Graduate School and University Center. We also, let me just introduce really quickly Min Zhou, and then we can go quickly. And Min Zhou is a professor of Dr. Min Zhou is a professor of sociology and Asian American studies. She's the Walter and Shirley Wang Endowed Chair in U.S.-China Relations and Communications and the founding chair of the Asian American Studies Department at UCLA. So first we'll have Dr. Hector Cordero-Guzman, and he'll be speaking on the role of community-based organizations in labor markets and the development of sectoral worker networks.
Thank you. My name is Hector Cordero. I'm a professor at the City University of New York, the city's public university. It's a pleasure to be here. You see the title of my paper. If I wanted to be provocative, I perhaps could have titled my paper, "Was it the invisible hand that found jobs for close to 7 million undocumented workers? And if it didn't do so, how did it not do so?" Or if I was talking to a bunch of structuralists, I may have called the paper, "How do transnational and migrant workers in search of jobs in a regional and global labor market protect themselves against the abuse and exploitation of employers and develop institutions to meet their needs?" And that's, so between one and the other is kind of where this presentation is going to go. And we have a lot of history and background around people thinking about stratification issues, but unfortunately, from time immemorial, even until today, we do think about this stratification in very much individual level terms, so we worry about people. And we really haven't brought in enough, I think, the organizational and institutional dimensions of how stratification plays itself out and reproduces itself. So this paper is perhaps an attempt to try to move beyond the individual level stratification discussion and think more about what role do groups and organizations play in this process. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the formation of worker centers and worker center networks. I'll discuss some specific cases. I won't have time to go into everything on all of them, so I'll jump it around a little bit, but I mainly want to talk about day laborers, domestic workers, restaurant workers, direct care workers. And I really want to discuss how organizations that work with these workers and support these workers do kind of day in, day out bricks and mortar work in the labor market to improve conditions at work, quality jobs, access to training opportunities, worker organizing, and advocacy. And in terms of a little context, I mean, one of the things we can think about is how traditional labor market theory thinks about how people get matched to jobs, and you have the kind of whole invisible hand, straw man that I just said. And you can think about, well, supply meets demand in some kind of magical, invisible hand way. And a lot of sociologists, institutionalists, criticize that simplistic model by saying, well, it's really about structures and institutions. And I think they overplayed their hand going on the segmentation side too much. And Granovetter's groundbreaking work, I think it's kind of like a middle in between the structuralist and the pure individualist in talking about ties and strong and weak ties and how are these ties formed and maintained. And I think today we're beginning to recognize more and more, not just the individual, family, community dimensions of labor market matching processes, but the organizational and the evolution of these intermediary organizations that have come in and really done the work of matching supply and demand and doing a lot of work on the supply side, a lot of work on the demand side, and a lot of work in terms of matching workers to jobs. By way of context, the National Employment Law Project just did a study of low-wage workers on the low-wage labor market that found that about 15% of the wages of low-wage workers are stolen. And it's not by asking workers where your wage is stolen. It's simply by asking workers how many hours did you work, what did you do, et cetera, and then asking them how much were you paid, and then doing computations. People are asked to stay off the clock, people are asked to come in earlier, they don't not given breaks. So when you really compute it, you find that about 15% of the money is not getting to the people, and that brought a lot of, or part of the the challenge with a study like that is that it doesn't have any agency. So part of what I want to try to bring into this paper is the whole question of agency, which has also come up before, and the role that organizations play in becoming vehicles for workers, not just to take these conditions, but to try to do something to change them. So it talks about individuals and social structures, but it also talks about interorganizational structures and networks and what role they play in articulating these needs. I'm going to really zoom through the context because I don't think we need a lot of context. This slide just tries to give you a sense of how the labor market institutions have changed over time, and some of them we may want to call stylized facts. There may be disputes about one or the other, but we know that we're in a different labor market today than perhaps we were 25 years ago, characterized really by some of these trends that I don't want to go over in detail, but in the paper they'll be discussed appropriately. And it is created for workers increased spells of unemployment, more inequality within and between occupations, increasingly disjointed careers, workers having to manage more job transitions, workers really needing to support the labor market, and close to 25% of the US labor force works in what we may want to call low-wage jobs. And what you have here is 3 different definitions of what a low-wage worker could be: poverty threshold, bottom 25%, 2/3 median wage. And we really have between 20 and 25% again of the labor force, a non-trivial number, that are working in this bottom of the labor market, and that varies by race and ethnicity. And this next slide, prepared by Professor John Molenkoff at City University for one of our projects, really describes by broad race and ethnic category what's been happening to the low-wage labor market. And notice, for example, that close to half of Latino females work in low-wage jobs, and a non-trivial number of Latino males, black females, and to some extent even black males. So it's a big chunk of the labor market. And I think there's a paradox out there that when you interview employers about workers, they say they don't find the workers with the skills they need. And when you interview workers, they tell you that they feel their skills are underutilized, undervalued. So I sometimes have a challenge trying to make sense. And when you talk to people about this increasingly complex labor market, they tell you that there are a bunch of individual level challenges and a bunch of structural level challenges, including lack of information, fear of accessing public services, lack of familiarity, difficulty accessing specific entry points, barriers related to eligibility requirements. And at the institutional level, in terms of people accessing the labor market, accessing workforce services, there are no clear program guidelines, some inadequate information provision, multiple funding streams with different very complex reporting requirements, and really a lot of discontinuities in service provision. Harlem Children's Home being a counterexample of this whole issue of discontinuity in service provision by trying to be comprehensive in the services they provide. So I'm now getting to who I really want to talk about, and this is the low-wage workers. And what you have here is just the list of the largest low-wage occupations that have more than 500,000 employees, from the top retail salespersons to the bottom, some cafeteria attendants. So I really organized the table around 3 segments of the low-wage labor market. The top segment, the top 15 million workers, are workers that have some access to the workforce development system as it is currently configured. The middle tier are really complex sectors. So for example, in the restaurant industry, you could have culinary institutes that are top class, but you could have vast segments of the industry that are pretty much wild, wild west. And at the bottom, you really have the bottom of the low-wage labor market, which are the domestic workers, maids, and then the contingent day laborers. And others. And the groups that I talk about really try to focus on the middle and the bottom of the low-wage labor market, which are the segments that are much more problematic and where there's been less organizational response, and that's what I want to really talk about. So over the last 10, 15 years, a vast array of worker centers and worker-based and worker-led organizations have evolved around the country, and Janice Fine, a professor at Rutgers, wrote a book on worker centers about 5, 6 years ago that really tries to detail how these institutions develop. And for a range of reasons, trying to combat issues like wage theft. And we have different types of these worker centers, organized from a particular community or based on managing particular corners, or some multi-service organizations that opened up some kind of worker program. Some that are part of multi-service, some that are unions set up, some that are part of churches and congregations and interfaith groups. So there are many origins to this vast infrastructure of worker centers, and this slide tries to walk you through some of the different origin points. So the last category being some ethnic and national origin groups: a Filipino worker center, a Korean immigrant workers advocates in LA, Kiwa. Those of you that are in LA may have heard of both organizations. And these organizations share amongst each other a range of characteristics that make them very unique. First, they operating, as I showed you, large segments of the low-wage labor market. So it's not a group that's trying to be set up to help 10 people. It's a group that's being set up because there are vast segments of the industry that need the help and support. Significant proportions of low-wage workers, significant proportions of people of color, sectors that are service-oriented with significant demand and that are not exportable. The nannies are going to be there throughout. The day laborers are going to be there throughout. The restaurant workers are going to be there throughout. We're not trying to tackle specific industries that may leave tomorrow. So there's a certain permanency to the sectors where they're working. Working sectors where there are significant allegations of health, wage, and hour violations. We give them a lot of motivation to get going. They have a national presence. There are nannies all over the country. It's not just a sector in one city alone. There's potential for making jobs better through a combination of techniques, and are really involved in sectors where we've seen some advancements and developments over time. So these are the 4 networks that I want to talk to you about. You have the 33 million low-wage workers, and these 4 networks really cover the kind of bottom of the low-wage labor market. There's about the 6.7 million construction contingent workers represented by the National Day Labor Organizing Network, the domestic workers represented by the National Domestic Workers Alliance, the home care, direct care workers represented by the Direct Care Alliance, and the Restaurant Opportunity Center working with workers in the restaurant industry. And the case that I want to make is that the supply and demand kind of workers and jobs meet each other through the work of these intermediaries. And they do assessment, case management, training, job placement, post-placement services, and on the demand side with employers, they work on wage policies, employment-sponsored training, employer-sponsored benefits, hiring practices. So they're very much in the middle of bringing workers and connecting workers to jobs. And let me just give you a few examples from a few of the networks of kind of what they do. So the Direct Care Alliance, which works with people that take care of elderly and disabled in their homes, has essentially 4 activities that are listed on the top. And what you have here is what activities they do where, more or less. But what I really want to focus on is their work on the last point, which is professionalize the workforce through a competency-based credentialing system for personal assistance workers who aid elders and people with disabilities. So if you think about this sector, people think, well, it's just cooking and cleaning for old people. Anybody can do that. We should just pay the minimum possible wage we could pay for that, sometimes even below the minimum wage. When you talk to the workers, when you talk to some of the providers, some of the employers, what you realize is that that one job that people say anybody can do and it's just cooking and cleaning, it's in fact 3 jobs. There may be that one entry-level job that may involve, some record keeping, some applying health sanitation standards, some personal care procedures, but there is a middle tier there, using medical terminology, weighing patients, moving patients regularly, mental health issues. And when you deal with elderly people and dealing with their relatives, can be really complicated from a mental health standpoint. And then very specialized work. So what they're doing is taking this one job that people say it's this anybody can do, cooking and cleaning, and say, no, there are really 3 jobs here. There's an entry-level job that should pay whatever the minimum is, but there's a middle-level job that should pay more, and there's a third-level job that should pay even more. So they're laddering what can be considered an undifferentiated labor market. And these are, again, nonprofits, groups that take it upon themselves to work with workers, work with employers, work with foundations to really develop this kind of a curriculum and an example of the kinds of intervention that these organizations make in terms of, again, taking one undifferentiated job and turning it or making it more accurately reflect the work that people do, setting up a credential so that workers can be trained and can show employers, no, I'm a level 3, I'm not a level 1. So you should really pay me level 3 wages because I can do X, Y, and Z. The National Day Labor Organizing Network is a vast network of groups that work with day laborers. And as you know, the day labor issue caught a lot of attention. And I owe a lot of this work to colleague Abel Valenzuela at UCLA, who's done the path-breaking work on this. And this is an organized market. Trucks would run into a Home Depot. Workers would run into the truck. There were all kinds of ordinances and statutes passed to prohibit this activity. It still continued even with the no trespassing sign next to it and all of that. Workers still needed work and employers still needed employers, and more fines and more kind of the law enforcement approach, ultimately, where you have the kind of, and you can read Westminster, kind of is next to Irvine in Southern California. Now it became like a law enforcement issue. The workers, the cop, and the employers. Not a really good setup for many communities. So this, and then on the other hand, as workers were getting these jobs, the death rate of Latino workers in these kinds of settings went up to about 990 in 2006, which is about 3 workers per day dying in some kind of work-related condition. So unacceptable conditions from a community perspective and unacceptable conditions from a worker perspective, worker health and safety perspective. So the NDLON embarked upon a range of activities to help their members. And you don't have to read them because I'm going to show you one at a time in kind of pictures. Engage in a range of activities to help mitigate both the community employment situation and the health and safety situation for the workers. They're engaged in member recruitment, identifying training needs and best approaches to work with and train the workers through meetings and dialogues and discussions and talking to experts in the various fields. They develop adult education, human capital building, and training initiatives for their workers, including plumbing, electric, and these are partnerships sometimes between worker centers and community colleges that provide the training. Occupational health and safety, you notice all the workers have their gloves, they have their hats, they have their, well, caps in this case. They have masks to protect them, things that they weren't doing before that was affecting their health in ways unknown. And even working on trying to take corners. This is a project with public architecture to really think about how do we go from a corner into a place that looks more hospitable for workers and employers to really do and transact their business. We've also, our organizations have also been involved in doing organizational building work, and that requires leader identification and training, leadership development, organizational change management, leadership development, understanding the industries where their workers work and understanding the employers and talking to employers and interviewing employers, developing specific training and career ladders, example we see from the direct care workers, and really trying to get deep into what employers want so that they can provide workers with the kind of training that they need to be able to access those jobs, and really involved in advocacy and lobbying around wage enforcement and worker rights more generally to seek improvements in the lives of low-wage workers. The National Domestic Workers Alliance similarly has worked with the domestic workers sector. They're between 1.5 and 2 million, depending on the state of the economy. And it's a coalition of organizations in these different parts of the country that have come together to develop a range of, again, supply-side, worker-based, and demand-side, employer-based interventions. Their last victory was a few months ago in New York City, where they passed the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, the first in the country. And there is an effort in California now to do the same. Domestic workers, as you may know, are of the few worker categories that are excluded by name from the Fair Labor Standards Act. The act says they will include, but it will not include domestic workers. And it's a long story to say about that. So this act is the first time to really make sure that workers are included. And they do a congress where they bring workers together. They do training on green cleaning, on contract negotiation, how to ask for a sick day to your employer, how to ask for a day off to go to school, to have meetings with your children and their teachers. And they've done research projects in California and in New York, really letting us know about who these domestic workers are, what they do, how they do it, what are their conditions, what are their characteristics. And in the end, really working on improving the quality of the jobs through increasing information about jobs, reducing accidents, improving worker health and safety, improving the capacity of workers to act together and negotiate. Let me talk a little bit about the Restaurant Opportunity Center, because it provides an example of really demand-side or employer-based interventions. They've done a lot of the supply-side work on the workers, and this is just a graph from one of their reports that talks about, they interview the workers about, and you see the question in the corner, have you done something that has put your own safety at risk? And it's frequently, sometimes, never, don't know. And then they cross that against the violations of the restaurants where the workers worked. And all of you brilliant social scientists will immediately see a beautiful relationship between the environment where you work and how what your boss is asking you to do and what you end up doing. So that it isn't just the workers themselves wanting to take risk. They're put in environments where risk is a requirement of keeping the job. So it is these conditions that this identifying and then tackling the low roaders, if you will, is part of what this organization does. So it does training on the supply side through its creatively named Chow School. Colors is the name of the restaurant in the Village in New York, the Oa Co-op restaurant. Colors Hospitality Opportunities for Workers Institute. So it's a training program, but they also work on the employer side in identifying restaurateurs and businesses that do best practices, that treat their workers right, and then beginning to think about a credentialism or information system so that consumers that want to know this information would opt to shop in places that legitimately treat their workers right and are not violating their rights. And they have engaged in various employer activities, bringing together some of these high-road employers and using employers as a tool to argue against the bad employers, to say, well, we cannot compete fairly if there are people that are getting away with murder. There's also been increased network development among these groups that connected with organized labor, community colleges, training providers, research institutions, because organizations are network organizations and they work in a broader field. So they've really cultivated their field, and this is just an example of a meeting, almost like a quiz. Guess who are the traditional union members in this picture, and guess who are the worker center people in this picture. But it's great that they're talking together, and there's translation, and there's dialogue, and there's conversation about bringing sectors together. And this is at the beautiful UCLA Labor Center in downtown. So again, the field is moving from this magic hand of workers somehow in a corner meet employers to a really structured mechanism and way through which nonprofits really work the labor market and structure the labor market. through a range of supply-side activities, a range of demand-side activities, and really a range of activities that now engaged in developing their capacity as organizations to do their work through leadership development, organizational change management, network building. So they've built by now a broad infrastructure that works within sectors of the low-wage labor market and then trying to work across sectors. And they've been supported really by 3 support organizations: the National Employment Law Project, the UCLA Labor Center, and the Center for Urban Economic Development at UIC, who provide a lot of the research that some of these networks need to develop their work. And they've been very successful in bringing attention to their issues in Washington. This is just a poster from the US Department of Labor's first summit on Latino worker health and safety that had over 1,000 participants, including members of all these networks. So ultimately, I think what they do is they provide real people with concrete opportunities to earn credentials, concrete opportunities to through these credentials, build a better future. Because ultimately, these are the people that cook for us. These are the people that clean our homes. And these are the people under whose wages really a healthy society is sustained. So these organizations really help these individuals come out from under the shadows, if you will, and become a vehicle for them to go up. Since I have 30 seconds, I want to talk to you a little bit about the research methods that I use. I use very intense participant observation with some of these networks. We had opportunities to go to Washington, D.C., and participate in events and demonstrations. And I also provided opportunities in panels and discussions for them to, for me to learn about them and from them to kind of learn about me. And we also were able to do a survey with about 600 groups around the country in New York, Chicago, and LA. So it's not just impressionistic, that's what I'm trying to say. There's a lot of data behind it, even though as a presentation I've tried to make it perhaps a little bit more lighthearted than I should have. So I appreciate very much your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
So next up we have Dr. Min Zhou. His title is Ethnic Chinese Transnational Organizations in the United States, Community Building and Economic Incorporation.
Today I want to share with you some of my research on one immigrant group and how that group's community building experience speak to larger issues of the importance of institutions. So this is a study. We study immigrant transnationalism through organizations created by Chinese immigrants in the United States. And we are looking at 2 outcomes. One is how organizational involvement in the ethnic community affects immigrant adaptation. And then the other one is, since it's transnational, how that affects homeland development in China. And my presentation today focuses on immigrant adaptation in the US. And currently I collaborate with Alejandro Portes at Princeton University on a larger project of immigrant transnational organizations. And we have already written a paper which will be presented at a conference 2 months later at Princeton on the impact of transnational organizations on homeland development. If you are interested, I will be happy to send off that paper. So existing research on transnationalism look at transnationalism as a way of life inherent to immigrant experience, and also as a source of as sources of support for immigrants that for immigrant families left behind. And transnationalism also now is looked at as an alternative mode of immigrant incorporation in terms of their positive effect on socioeconomic mobility or very effect on political incorporation. And then also as a means of status, symbolic status attainment for immigrants. As we all know, immigrants, when they move from one place to another, they experience status inconsistency, and that is a common symptom. But through transnational organizations, somehow, some way they can regain that social status in this particular transnational space. But findings are kind of mixed. It's not all positive. Some positive, some negative, and for some groups, there are more positive results, and on other groups, there are kind of moderate or, if not, no effect. Say in terms of political incorporation, immigrant transnationalism, for some group, it encouraged involvement in homeland politics rather than here in hostland politics. But other groups like the Chinese, it really, because it's impossible to involve in homeland politics, so they engage more in hostland activities. There is a gap in this research, and one of the gap is the unit of analysis has focused primarily on the individual and less on the organization. These two units of analysis, the distinction is important, even though they are correlated, because a lot of immigrants, they engage in transnationalism, they engage in transnational activities actually through organizations. And then there are also implicit assumptions about the underdeveloped or undeveloped homeland and about immigrant agency. And then US-based sociological research has almost entirely drawn on the experience of Latin American immigrants, and studies on Asian transnationalism is spotty at best or non-existent at worst. Now, why focus on the Chinese, on organizations created by Chinese immigrants per se? Well, one is because it's convenience. I'm Chinese, bilingual, and it helps me to get into the community better. But there are more reasons for that. One is Chinese has one of the largest diaspora in the world. And the US concentrates the highest number of Chinese ancestry people outside of Asia. And currently there are 3.6 million in the United States. As a matter of fact, if you are looking at the new immigrant group, the Chinese is one of the largest group. It's the largest group next to Mexicans for the immigrant group. Chinese immigrants to the US is one of the largest and oldest non-European immigrant group. And then when we talk about transnationalism, China is the largest homeland in the world and has the fastest growing economy. So immigrants, when they engage with the homeland, now it's not like the homeland is not like underdeveloped. If anything, it provides tremendous resources and opportunities for immigrants. So immigrants here, if their route to social mobility is blocked, they can possibly seek out the homeland for an alternative means of social mobility. So there are, in this particular paper, I focus on two questions. One is how immigrant transnational organizations compare to the US-based ethnic organizations that are located and serving Chinese American communities. And secondly, what bearings do these organizational forms have on community building and successful economic incorporation of Chinese immigrants in the United States? And then data, we built an inventory of 1,370 ethnic Chinese organizations in the US. Those organizations are kind of formal, they are listed organizations, and then did a survey of 55 ethnic Chinese organizations and their leaders, in-depth interviews with organization leaders in the US and also with the Chinese officials in charge of overseas Chinese affairs at various levels of government and as well as field observations. Now here is kind of a look of these organizations that we collected. So as you can see, the majority are the hometown associations, the homeland associations. And then we also have a lot of professional organizations, alumni organizations. Most of the alumni organizations are college alumni organizations that reflects the diversity of the Chinese immigration today. And then there are civic organizations, social service organizations. Those social service organizations are mostly community-based nonprofit organizations. But other organizations, they are purely immigrant ethnic organizations. And then there are other organizations as well. In our interviews of 46 completed interviews of organizations, we found that about a third of them really engage in transnational organizational activities. Now, if you are looking at organizational development in the Chinese immigrant community, there are differences between pre-1980 development and post-1980. Why 1980? Because even though the Hart-Celler Act of 1965 allowed Asian immigrants to come in, but it was not until late 1970s that China opened up to allow immigrants to leave, to join their families overseas. So prior to 1980, a lot of the ethnic organizations are really based on Chinatown, and they developed from the 1870s and to the 1950s. And these, during this long period, the community have suffered from legal and social exclusion by the Chinese Exclusion Act. So there are three major forms of organizations arise, and they kind of operate like the church, if you can think about what the churches do. They do all the churches do, but in addition, they also work as an economic unit, like run as a credit union, helping businesses to develop, because the community is isolated from the larger society and it's excluded, so they have to mobilize self-help to generate jobs and resources for its members. So there are three types. One is family clan associations. The second one is district associations. That's really a village-based or a place-based organizations. And the third type is merchants associations. Those immigrants who do not belong to those big family associations or district associations, then they can belong to the merchants association. In the Chinese case, the merchants association, the traditional form, it includes workers, because the workers are their members as well. And then during that time, there are community-based organizations developed. But those community-based organizations, the nonprofits, social service organizations, they were developed mostly after the 1960s civil rights movement. So they are developed to fight poverty, to help immigrants, and provide social welfare. Here is to give you a look of Chinatown. If you are going into Chinatown, you see a lot of businesses, right? But a lot of those buildings were actually owned by organizations, by those family organizations, various organizations. So those organizations in the past, they bought up real estate collectively. So by now, their real estate could generate tremendous amount of resources by rent. Like a smaller family association, if they own a building, they can generate $500,000 in rent per year to have programs or stuff for support or reinvestment and things. And here is the Lee Family Association, one of the big association, and E Family Association in San Francisco. So they have these buildings, and on the lower floor of the buildings, they have businesses. And some of the family association in New York, family association in Chicago, and then these are the tongs. The tong is really the merchants association, and in the old days, there are a lot of those organizations, and you probably hear about the territory conflict within Chinatown, and that's between family organizations and the tongs, the merchants associations. So everybody have their own territory. So in order to mediate the internal conflict, they established the CCBA, the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association. It's an umbrella organization. Historically, it's like the quasi-government of Chinatown. And so just to give you an example about the CCBA in New York, it established in 1883, and it made up of 60 member organizations. And so even though CCBA seems, if you are looking at their mission, seems to be non-transnational, but a lot of the family associations and district associations that exist today, they are very transnational. So CCBA operates more like the nonprofit social service organizations that we are familiar with, but their member organizations runs transnational activities for its members. And a lot of the elite members in these organizations are the local business owners, like the Chinatown owners. So this is the CCBA. And then, by the way, I always equate the CCBA to a Catholic church in the community because they offer a lot of services, and also they operate schools. The school they operate is a Chinese school, but learning Chinese is not the point, but rather it's learning Chinese is to provide educational opportunities for the children, and also to enforce the goal of social mobility for immigrant families. If you're looking at the transnational organizations, you see the kind of values and goals. Their American dream is threefold. One is to own your own home. The other is to be your own boss. And then the third one is to send your kids to the Ivy League. And that goal is very, very much focus. Like they only focus on these three things. So a lot of the opportunities that they have is to help you how to own real estate, and then to own homes. Like in New York, if you are immigrants for 3 years, you can buy a house in Queens. How could you do that? You pull up family resources and you live in the basement and rent out the 3 floors. That's the way you are trying to own your homes. And as a matter of fact, that some of the respondents that I study way back in my graduate school time, I ran into them that they own real, that they were government workers. I asked how they are doing. They said, oh, I pay off my house, now I'm moving up. So they are moving up to their, they're living a good life now. But so I really feel humble when I am with these garment workers that I had worked with and interviewed them 20 years ago, 20-some years ago, because I still have a mortgage to pay. So they do this to help the immigrants to own home, and then also help them run business. Now, the business is how the transnational organization is helping. They help them find opportunities both in town and then across the ocean. So that way they help them build connections. And then after 1980s, we see a lot of expanded hometown associations. Those expanded hometown associations, it's based on a municipality and at the provincial level. So even like Beijing, they can claim that they are the sending community of overseas Chinese. But they just use it as a name to organize the immigrants. And economic and business organizations, professional organizations, alumni organizations, and all these newer organizations, they are not locally based. However, they operate activities in Chinatown or the Chinese ethnobird, the suburb, because that's the place that draw people from all over the place. Other times, they are on the cyberspace. So to summarize, there is a very high density and variety of immigrant organizations, and about a third of them involved in transnational activities. And those organizations play the general function of offering services to the immigrants, helping immigrants to conduct their daily life in the United States. But transnationalism, as I mentioned, only a third of the organizations are actually involved in transnationalism. Individuals, a lot of them are engaged in transnational opportunities through organizations. For example, if you go to China as an individual, nobody knows you. But if you go to China, you establish an organization, and then you said, I am the president of the Hometown Association, then you get to meet the provincial leaders and that, right? So it's a status thing. But individually, those who are engaged in organizational activities are likely to be married men and with U.S. citizenship, because then that allow you to travel freely and have relatively stable employment already. And then most of those organizations are lodged in Chinatown and Chinese as ethnoburb, even though the newer organizations that are on cyberspace, but they have regular activities in these communities, like in a restaurant or in the CCBA, in those community buildings. And then they offer tangible resources for support of these immigrant goals. And then they also offer space, like the church also offers space for face-to-face contact and connections. And then, when you are in the organization or when you are transnational, you become big shot. Whereas, you may be working in the garment shop or working in the restaurant. And then that way, because those activities are all in the community, and then the people who are of middle class background or of lower class background, they get interact. So that way, the mixed class interaction alleviates the negative effect of social isolation. And in a way, that connects to my other study of Chinatown and Koreatown on the local social structures. My finding of that study is the local social structures is very ethnically based. So for immigrant groups that have strong resources to come on arrival and also strong human capital resources, then they tend to build ethnic businesses in the community. And those ethnic businesses could allow for the rise of other organizations like the professional organizations, religious organizations, as well as a range of private for-profit enterprises serving children. So that way, when you are within the community, it kind of creates a social environment to promote the community's goal, which is this 3 thing. Yeah, I'm done. So for the immigrants, they love to be associated with Chinatown and the ethnoburb. For the children, they hate it because it's stifling. They can't go have fun. They have to go to Chinese school. They have to go to the after-school tutoring. Their after-school activities, whether you are middle class or working class, is structured because there are available resources at the neighborhood level, even in Chinatown. So I'm done here. Thank you.
Well, first off, thanks very much for those great presentations. Certainly a treat to give some feedback, especially because I believe both of these projects are still sort of being worked on or sort of in progress. And so I basically just have 2 broad issues that sort of bridge both of the papers, and then also 1 individual question for each of you. And I was thinking about the first issue being the issue of fields and organizational environments. I know that we're moving towards a more integrating this idea of organizations within our analysis of inequality and within our analysis of poverty. And integral to that are the environments in which these organizations live in. And I think this is basically Hector's idea, but I'd like for him to just speak a little bit more slowly about the context in which organizational networks are formed. And I think it's important to think about sort of moving towards sketching out broader patterns in which organizations can form networks amongst each other. And so there are different types of networks, and I'm thinking about networks between each other. So in what sort of conditions are sort of faith organizations, faith immigrant organizations, creating networks with secular organizations, and what are these outcomes, right? Or actually also between different types of organizations, so immigrant rights organizations, for example, and non-immigrant, non-grassroots organizations like foreign consulates, for example. If we think of the example of Chicago, the Mexican foreign consulate here in Chicago plays a really active role with immigrants' rights organizations. But in other cities like San Jose, that's not the case. The Mexican foreign consulate there has a really defined role. It has a really defined understanding of what it does, which is much different from the grassroots level. So, and I think that thinking about the context in which networks are formed becomes important because networks allow for the creation of larger projects all the way to the creation of sort of galvanizing movements that can actually bring about social change or bring this issue of poverty to a national level. So if we could just move towards sketching out some of the conditions under which these organizations are found and can create some of these networks. And I think the second broad issue is really how can we move towards assessing the success rates or assessing really the outcomes of these immigrant organizations. We hear a lot about the ways that they will offer services, the ways that they will provide resources, but how can we actually move towards understanding that these organizations work and bring about a difference in people's lives that above and beyond sort of maybe a selection issue or other things. Okay, and then specifically for men, I was thinking about really what effect do these transnational organizations have on inequality? In a broader sense. On the one hand, I can see these organizations providing resources and services, but on the other hand, I could see that these organizations might employ sort of gatekeeping strategies such that only certain immigrants from certain provinces are allowed into these transnational organizations, or are allowed entryway or access to these resources. So what does that mean towards the broader sort of immigrant population, particularly the broader Chinese immigrant population? And the last question that I have is a fun one for Hector, since I know that he worked for a while or still works for the Ford Foundation. It is often found in the literature that people that work with or have studied grassroots organization that there's really an imprint or an effect that happens when foundations move in. When foundations sort of come in and provide the resources to an organization that was before sort of gathering resources from the grassroots, creating its agenda from the grassroots. And I wonder what you think the sort of entryway of, for example, resources from the Ford Foundation, resources from the United Way, or resources from different foundations have had on these sort of workers' rights organizations. One sort of common hypothesis that happens is that these grassroots organizations move from more protest and advocacy towards direct services because of the demands placed on them by foundations. And so I'm wondering if you can just speak to that and tell us sort of, do we see a move from sort of these grassroots organizations moving from sort of advocacy and rights towards the provision of services? Is some of that control lost away from the community, et cetera?
Wow, you really have your finger on the pulse of what's going on. Those are three incredibly powerful comments. Luckily, on the first one about the different networks and type of networks that emanate, I did a paper a few years ago with Nick Theodore using the data from our surveys. We were surveying groups in 2005, and then I was at a panel at the ASA meetings in 2006 where a discussant on papers on political participation of Latinos said, and one of the things we really need to do is to understand the spontaneous demonstrations that happened in 2006 around immigration issues. And I was like, spontaneous? I've been in the field for 2 years interviewing all these groups. This is like a moment they've been waiting for. They've been building all. So we wrote a paper about the different types of networks that were involved in Chicago and New York and how these mobilizations came about. So maybe in some of that paper teases out this whole issue of network formation and network building and the different types of networks. On the issue of the consulates, I think Min's also done some, on the transnational work. It's an issue that comes up repeatedly. I think there's incredible variation in terms of how different consulates approach their own communities. And I think that's definitely a topic of study. And in the Mexican community, I know there's an active effort because the Mexican government has been very involved, and people like Rob Smith and others have done some incredible work on that. On the issue of success rates and outcomes, that is the holy grail of the entire nonprofit sector, not just of immigrant serving organizations. This issue of how do you document what you do, how do you measure it, how do you measure effectiveness, how do you assess effectiveness. What I can tell you kind of by way of anecdote is that I was having a discussion with an MIT economist about one of these networks and said, well, you know, but can you make the case that this specific network has changed wages for all workers in the sector? And I was like, well, that's a curious measure of success. How much money does it take to change wages in an entire industry? But okay, yeah, they did pass a legislation that changed the minimum wage, so I guess technically they did have an impact on the wages of all the workers. And second, I said, I was listening to the radio the other day about the paid sick days debate, and the industries did a study, and the workers did a study, and the industry study basically said paid sick days are too expensive. The workers, and the industry study may have cost a couple of $100,000. The worker study may have cost $5,000, and the worker advocate just had to say, they can cough on your food for everybody to agree with paid sick days. So I said, well, if you measure effectiveness in terms of how much bang for your buck you get for your research, it looks like the workers are ahead by hundreds of thousands of dollars. So there are different ways of measuring impact and understanding what impact is, and I think the field is really in active debate for external reasons, funder-driven, and for internal reasons, their own desire, like we saw in the Harlem Children's Zone, of really operate at the most effective possible way. And I think nonprofits sometimes do get, I think, short shrift on how hard they work on trying to do things well. And oftentimes, I plead guilty sometimes to this. The casual outside observer can come in and say, well, in the 2 days that I was there, it didn't really work like magic, therefore you're horrible. So I think that there's a lot on both sides, on the group side and on the researcher side, that needs to be worked out for that conversation to be a lot more effective. On the role of foundations and in terms of movement from advocacy to service provision, I think you're absolutely right on that. And I won't say much more because it's a really complicated conversation. And I really want to kind of write about this because I lived it. The whole issue of different types of funders and how different types of funders want to lead versus follow versus get out of the way. It depends on the context, and in certain contexts you do want to kind of do the leading, not because you know better, but because you have specific guidelines within your funding that people fit or don't. In other times, in certain contexts, the good funder is indistinguishable from a gas attendant at the New Jersey Turnpike. Just say how much gas do you need and just fill your tank and you keep going. So in certain conditions, funders should just stay away. Under other conditions, they don't. And I think that's a fascinating topic, and I will write a paper about it on the good, the bad, and the ugly around the interaction between funders and advocacy nonprofits. Thank you for the questions. They were phenomenal.
Yeah, I just briefly respond to a couple of points that Cristina raised. One is the assessment of the outcome of organizations. That actually I want to respond to your questions to Hector. And I feel that assessing outcome is kind of complicated, and it's almost like unfair to ask a particular organization to have the kind of outcome that you expect them to have, because for a community, it's not just one organization. They have to work with many different organizations. So if it's seemingly that organization, say the organization is helping children, the children are not doing as well as you would expect. But the fact that the organization there and providing services, it's better than have no organizations serving the needs there. So the outcome assessment, I would be very careful when we are thinking about that issue, because it's the whole community. It's not just one organization individually, and we have to think about at a higher level, not just at one organization. And then the other one, the other question that is specifically to my talk is the issue of inequality. Yes, the kind of organizations in the ethnic community, it reinforce social inequality and class segregation and class reproduction within the group and across group, because there are resources that some of the immigrants do not get access. However, so the elites are still the elites, and they take advantage of the availability of the resources, like cheap labor resources as one. But they also, like the community, also benefit the low-income, newer immigrant families in terms of helping them to get jobs, helping their children to do good in school. Just to give you an example, there are for-profit services in the community. So you can pay $5 for after-school tutoring per hour or $100 also in the community. So you could see that the ones that you pay $100 an hour tend to attract the middle class, and those others tend to be the low-income families. But the fact that they are there, and they are also there side by side with those other services, it creates an environment that help the low-income families to do well in school. And there are studies that have shown that Asian immigrant children are doing well even though they are coming from working class families, but the environment they are living in is very different. Like Latinos who live in the same community, they don't get access to these ethnic resources because one, they don't know. Second is because of the language and cultural barrier. So that is a challenge. The community resources are there, but the non-ethnic group are not there to, they are exclusive, so to speak.
Well, why don't we open it up? And obviously there's a lot here to think about. I think there's some questions in the audience. Nicole, and then the gentleman.
Hello. I have a question for Min. Your discussion of the organizations seems to tie the organizations very much to the boundaries of the community, especially when you're talking about Chinatowns and Chinese ethnoburbs. I wonder if you've thought at all about actually mapping out the relationships that different organizations within the community have to one another. For example, I know in New York's Chinatown, there's certainly divisions between different components of the community and different organizations that represent different components of the community. So I wonder if this sort of notion that all the organizations are together in the community working towards the same thing is really accurate. I wonder if you've thought about ways to empirically address that.
I did not do the geo-mapping, but I do, in my fieldwork, I do have data on these various organizations. And there are divisions in the community from day one, before there are a lot of territorial conflicts. And also today, we see the conflict actually between the publicly funded or foundation-funded nonprofit organizations and these ethnic organizations. Because the public-funded organizations, their mission is equity. Whereas the ethnic organizations, they don't have to abide by that, and equity is not their mission. Their mission is to provide their members the services that their members want. And their members could be middle class and could be lower class as well. It's a big spectrum. So in a way, that's kind of different from the Latino communities, because the Latino, take hometown associations, for example. The Latino communities also have a density of hometown communities, hometown associations. But the hometown associations, the members are mostly from the low-wage work, low-wage organizations, and they don't have the kind of property holdings as the hometown organizations of Chinatown. Hometown associations of Chinatown, one is intergenerationally. It's already 4th generation. Like Garrick Look, some of the hometown association would claim him as a member, even though he's not there. And also there are a lot of those family associations, they have tremendous human resources, human capital resources, as well as contact with the outside world. Their outside world is like the American mainstream middle class. So if you are going to some of the events that the family organizations run, you see a lot of mixed race people too, or people are, because they form families, right? When they form families, they become, they belong to that organization. So that alleviates a lot of the negative effect of social isolation associated with class. And the nonprofits, and also there is another basis for their division, is the nonprofits are English
predominantly English-speaking people running, hiring bilingual staff. But the ethnic organizations, they are ethnic language dominant. So in a way, that creates basis for division as well. So it's territory and language and then their mission.